Hey guys, welcome to this first lecture in the rendering section of this course. In this lecture, I'm going to cover how to use the render panel for outputting a final image of your scene to your hard drive. So let's talk a little bit about the scene I've got set up here. I've created a basic cube with some rounded edges, and then I've gone and set up some basic lights using a sun lamp and a hemi lamp here. And I've got this plane that I just threw under it so we can catch some shadows. And of course I've got my camera in the scene here. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to see when we jump over to this first panel here in the properties panel, which is for the render settings. So the first thing you're going to see is what we've been using to render with in this course. We've got the render button here, the animation button, and the audio button. You're probably only ever going to use the render button and the animation button. The audio button will let you preview audio that you've composited within the scene, and it probably will only come in handy if you're going to use Blender to edit video with. And so that's what that's for. Animation would output a sequence of images or a final video of your animation of the scene to your hard drive. And then of course render will render the scene that we have here. And so if you go down to display, you might have seen me do this in the course, but just wanted to let you guys know that you can change where Blender renders your image on the screen. If you keep it in the image editor right here, it's going to constantly put this back into the image editor view that you see here. And you can also select new window, which will render it here. So if we're back in 3D view and I hit render now, it's going to render to this window here. You can just click out of that, and rendering if you get a full screen, you can see there that it'll take everything out of the UI and just give you a full screen view of the render in the image editor by itself. And so one of the other things you can do over here is lock the interface during rendering so that you can actually boost the memory to the render itself. So Blender was originally created where you couldn't do anything while the render was taking place. And so what they've done with the revamp is if you have a render that's taking quite a while, you can actually still go through and play with settings in the scene and tweak things while the render is taking place. Now it's not going to update live in the render, but it will allow you to go around and still continue working if you need to. So by doing this, you're not going to be able to do that. And let's just say we turn this up to something ridiculous like 6,000 by 6,000 pixels there, 100%. If I was going to go ahead and render this in a new window and lock that down, I'm going to keep this rendering on the other screen and it's still going, but I can't go do anything else. So as you can see, that's still rendering. I'm not able to click on anything like I normally am to do any changes. So I'm going to bring that back over so you can see. I'm going to hit escape to stop that. And now if I unlock this and I hit render, it's going to start rendering again. And so that's going. But now I can come back over here and still edit things in the scene. Now it's not going to be that fast because I'm rendering and it's using up my memory, but I can still get in here and rotate around. And depending on your system settings, you may have better specs than I do. And if that's the case, then you're going to find that it's going to be a lot faster than mine is when you're trying to edit. So just bear in mind that you do have that option of trying to boost the performance with that or taking that off and leaving that there. Let's get into the dimension settings. Now you do have presets if you're trying to match a specific type of layout for output to television or HDTV. So you can play with these. You can also manually set your render size here, which we've covered. So as you can see, that's a widescreen format. 1920 by 1080 is your typical HDTV setting. and this is going to control how much of this to render when you're trying to do previews. So if you don't want to preview at 100%, you can come down to something like 10 and then hit render, and it's going to shrink that down at 10% of whatever you've put into the X and Y columns. So pretty handy if you want to try to do some previews. Let's go over the frame range. If you're doing animations, this is just going to control how many frames of your animation are output to the computer when you hit this animation button. So start frame is always going to be 1, and then your end frame is going to be however far you've gone in your animation here in the timeline. Frame rate is going to be important if you're trying to match that with other footage, or you have a specific format you're outputting for. 24 is film, 2398 is for digital film, and then you've got 30 for TV, 2997 if you're editing with other video that's got that frame rate. 25 is sort of PAL settings for European venues. So just be aware that if you're going to get into frame rates, you do have options here to change those. And then you've also got some other options here. I'm not going to go over all these, but the border one is going to turn on the bordering rendering. And if I haven't gone over this, basically what it lets you do is if you're in a 3D view here with your camera up, if you hit Shift B on the keyboard, it's going to pull up something that looks like box select. But if you left click and drag at any part of the camera window, it's going to turn on border select here, and it's going to only render what's in that box. So if I hit render now, I'm only going to get what's in that box. So I'm going to turn this back up to something like 40% so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So it's just going to give me that preview there. Again, it's really handy if you want to just quickly see one very specific part of your render and make sure that settings you've created are taken into effect and changed the way you like. So be aware that that's available, and I definitely use that quite a lot. Let's go over anti-aliasing right here. So anti-aliasing is basically going to affect the amount of transitional smoothness on the edges of your objects and your scene. So to give you an example of what this looks like, I'm going to turn this off and I'm going to render this, and I hope you guys can see this. Let me try to up the dimensions. Let's go to 100%, render this. You guys see this edge right here? How it's all kind of jagged looking, something out of some early 90s computer graphics. Anti-aliasing is what fixes this. So what it does is it samples and oversamples edges of things in your scene, and it tries to smooth these transitions out from where it fades from one edge of a solid object to a background, things like that. So if I turn this back on, even with 5 samples, and we render, you're going to notice a big difference here on this edge. And the higher you go with the setting, the better it's going to look, but the more it's going to slow your render down. So with something simple like this scene, even at full res, it's not that big of a deal, but you will notice a huge performance hit when you start doing things like our fire hydrant scene if you up this all the way to 16. A big way to handle aliasing that a lot of people use is they will render the image, something low here, but they will render it twice the size, and then in post-processing they will shrink that back down to the final output version, and that will also take care of this aliasing issue. You've got options here for the kind of pixel filters you want to use for aliasing. It's by default set to this Mitchell. I know a lot of people also tend to use this Catmull ROM, and so it just depends on the effect you're going for, and play with those. You will notice a little bit of a difference there. So let's get into one more thing here is if you click full sample, it's going to give you a lot more detail in those edges. So what it's going to do is basically render out a scene first with full res, and then come back in, and it's going to kind of do multiple passes to try to solve some of these aliasing edges issues. So just be aware that full sampling is going to be handy if you're trying to get a little more punch in the detail areas and you're having problems with your edges. you can try to turn on full sampling, and it's going to solve some of those aliasing issues when you're compositing. And that's available here. Again, it will slow things down, so be aware of that. But that's definitely available. I'm not going to go over motion blur because we're not covering animation in this course, but you can turn on motion blur samples here, and it will try to give you motion blur. Let's go over shading. Shading is going to globally turn on and off your rendering capabilities for shadows, environment maps, ray tracing. So if we turn off ray tracing when we render, it's not going to give us shadows because we're trying to use ray trace shadows. So with that off, you can quickly preview and try to isolate problems as they're happening. So if I turn textures off, if we have textures showing here, it's not going to render textures. Things like that. Shadows, obviously, not going to render shadows, and so on and so on. So again, if you're trying to come in here and isolate some problems, quickly speed things up, you don't need to sample shadows or things like that. Turn that off, and it will give you whatever your scene's rendering without these settings. Performance is going to allow you to try to boost the rendering capabilities based on your system memory. So if you come in here, it's usually set to auto detect. If you have a multi-threaded processor, which you can take advantage of, you can come in here, go to fixed, and then if you want to set this to a number that's low, where you can manage what Blender's sucking out of your computer's power, so you've got other things you can do at the same time. You can definitely do that here. Limit the number of threads that it's going to use so that it's not just dominating your computer. I usually leave this alone and auto detect, and it uses all of the threads that it possibly can with my processor. That way, when I render, that's pretty much all I'm doing, and it's going to get it done as fast as possible. Again, you can come in here and play with these settings. You've got different options for how to use memory to kind of save time if you can tweak things to optimize your scene. So definitely check that out. Post-processing is going to control whether or not you're going to use things like compositing and the sequencer. Compositing is referring to the node editor that we're going to be going over in the next lecture coming up. And so with this turned on, it will allow your final render to pass through the node editor and allow you to composite results. Okay, so one of the other settings I want to go over is this edge setting. You turn this edge setting on and set it to something like a color here, and turn that on and render. You're going to get sort of a cartoony looking edge around any of your 3D objects in your scene. And so this is handy if you do want something a little bit more to that effect. You can turn up threshold and get a little bit different view there. One of the other things you can do is, instead of using this edge here, if you turn that off, you have another renderer that's available. They've added to Blender called Freestyle. If you check this off, it's gonna do the same sort of thing. It's gonna give you outlines for your renders, but you're gonna have a little bit more control over how those appear. So Freestyle's kind of useful if you're gonna do something like architectural renderings, previs, things like that. It'll enable you to outline your 3D objects and kind of give you more of a vectorized, hand-drawn feel. And so you can definitely come in here and play around with that. So if you guys come in and you've got a 3D render that you're using, and you're trying to watermark it or do something that you're preparing to send to a client, you can come in here and turn this stamp on. I'm going to turn these dimensions back down to something like 40 so you guys can see the whole render. And what you can do is come in here and put a note on your scene, rendered by Brandon Hicks. And then you can put notes on there like the kind of camera you're using, file name, lens, current marker you're at if you've added those in the timeline, and things like that. And then your text color can be, whatever you want it to be. So if you render now, it's going to put all that information as a watermark kind of on your scene for you. And so it's not real pretty, but it is really useful if you need it for quickly marking your scenes in terms of frame number and where we're at with the current scene you're working on. If you're using a big project, you need to make sure that every render you have has, you know, a timestamp here, and then you know, all your camera settings, and then of course time code is going to be useful for editing. That's going to do this automatically for you, so you don't have to do that later on when you go in and edit. So that's pretty handy. So that's the stamp. Last thing I'll cover is the output down here. If you do render an animation, this temp directory right here is what it's set to default put your frames or your movie into. If you click this button here, it's going to take you to anywhere on your hard drive where you're going to be using to output your scene to. So if you set this up to a specific render folder on your hard drive and then click accept, it's going to put that location here, and then you can have settings here for whether or not to overwrite files you've already written to, if you're doing a re-render, file extension settings, things like that. And if you hit animation, it's all going to go to this directory here. You can control the kind of format you're outputting to. These are all image formats that you should recognize. And then on the far right, you've got movie options. One thing, a bit of advice I would give you if you're going to do video, you're going to do animations, don't render to a final output movie here, because it's going to really limit your options in terms of you know, what you can do with it afterwards. It also is not good because if you get halfway into the render and it crashes, you're not going to be able to recover this information. So what I would recommend doing is keeping everything as separate as possible. Doing still frames for every single frame of your animation with these settings over here. It will output each frame as a separate file to your computer, and then of course you can go in and composite sound and things like that later in an editing program like Final Cut, and that's going to be a lot better, because again, if it crashes halfway through, you can pick up where you left off with the frame that you're on, and it's going to give you a lot better options for how to deal with problems like that. So that's about it for the render settings panel. There of course are more options that I covered, but definitely come in here and play around, and I think the ones that we did go over are going to be exactly what you guys need to definitely get started with your scenes. And so with that in mind, in the next lecture I'm going to show you how to set up your world settings in this panel over here for rendering, and then we're going to get into compositing. So I will see you in the next lecture.